Final Fantasy III exists in an unusual space within the Final Fantasy series. Alongside Final Fantasy V, this is probably the main series entry you'll hear the least about, the game that seems the most enigmatic. Final Fantasy III doesn't have the notorious reputation of Final Fantasy II. It isn't considered iconic for starting the series like Final Fantasy I, and it's not nearly as critically acclaimed as Final Fantasy IV, the game that came after it. Where does that leave us then? What is Final Fantasy III's identity? In this video, I'd like to bring Final Fantasy III into the limelight for a change, and do a proper deep dive to see what this often overshadowed entry into my favourite series is all about. There's nothing worse than introductions that go on too long, so let's cut to the chase and start off briefly by having a look at the background and history of Final Fantasy III. In both of the videos about Final Fantasy I and II, I went into a fair amount of detail about the development history of both of the games, their backgrounds, what influenced them, and so on. For Final Fantasy III, we can truncate that process a bit, and thankfully spend less time talking about it because there's not too much to say that wasn't previously covered in some way. Still, we need to quickly talk about the essentials. Final Fantasy III was released on the NES, known as the Famicom in Japan, just like Final Fantasy I and II. It was the last Final Fantasy released on the system, which makes sense when you consider that the SNES came out just under 7 months later, and Square wanted to capitalise on making a name for themselves on this brand new console. Just like with Final Fantasy II, we never ended up getting an official English language version of Final Fantasy III on the NES. Translations for both Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III were in the works at Square, but that effort ended up being rerouted into Final Fantasy IV's upcoming release on the SNES. I talk about this more in the Final Fantasy II video, because it ended up being nearly 15 years between II's release on the NES and its first release in the West. Final Fantasy III, believe it or not, had to wait even longer. It took over 16 years for us to get our hands on an official version of Final Fantasy III, and it was a totally new take on the game, being a from-the-ground-up 3D remake for the Nintendo DS. Still though, there was no way to play the original 2D game in English until almost another 15 years after the release of the 3D remake on the DS. Just a few months prior to this video being published, the Final Fantasy Pixel remasters were announced, a totally fresh and totally legitimate 2D reworking of the first 6 Final Fantasy games. Initially, when planning this video, it was just going to be about the 3D version, because I only want to talk about official versions of the game, nothing fan-translated. But then after the Pixel remaster of Final Fantasy III came out, this video ended up becoming more of a comparative situation. So, to sum up, this video will focus on the 2 Square Enix approved English language takes on the game that we have, the 3D remake on the DS and the recent Pixel remaster. I'm not really going to talk about the NES original at all. Also, rather than discussing the version differences here and now, we'll basically talk about how the 2 versions diverge in a more situational manner, when the need arises. I think that should help the video to flow a little bit better. To that end as well, this video will be split up into discrete chapters with timestamps in the description for your convenience. I guess now would also be the time to say that this video contains spoilers for Final Fantasy III. But if I'm being totally honest, you're probably fine to just watch this, even if you don't know what happens in the game. Final Fantasy III's story isn't that inspiring, and I doubt you'd gain much more from it if you played it yourself instead of getting a rundown here, but it's totally up to you. Anyway, whilst we're on the topic, it's likely for the best to go straight into the story and get a bit of context for what Final Fantasy III is all about. So, how we're going to approach this section is by taking it chronologically. We won't cover everything in the story, but we'll get a good grasp of the game's narrative, what it's trying to do, and also dive into any tangents that I think warrant further detail or analysis. As we meet characters, it's much the same idea. If they're interesting enough, we'll talk about them. If they aren't, we won't. So let's crack on. What is the premise behind Final Fantasy III's story? The game begins in a similar manner to Final Fantasy I, by means of a vague, nebulous, elementally charged prophecy, and the coming of the Warriors of the Light. Also, it all revolves around crystals, with the 4 youths in your party being appointed as saviors by a crystal they just accidentally stumble upon. As beginnings go, it's all a bit clumsy. There's no real reason given as to why you specifically have been chosen, and the arbitrary nature of this designation does mean that this journey can sometimes feel like it lacks urgency. But again, the reasoning behind that is simply that this game takes a lot of inspiration from the first Final Fantasy. Speaking of that, the 4 characters comprising your party in this game are also nameless placeholders. They have more going for them personality-wise in this game, and they do converse between each other, unlike in the first game, but it's still going for that idea of allowing the characters to be what is essentially an alternate form of a self-insert, allowing the player to envision themselves painted on this blank canvas. The 3D version differs in this regard though. It diverts hugely from the original, and instead gives you 4 named characters, all with distinct and separate identities. Their names are Luneth, Ark, Refia, and Ingus. It makes sense why they did this. If you're building the game anew, from the ground up, 16 years after the original release, you have to adapt, and it would not be appropriate to leave the 4 protagonists as totally blank canvases in a JRPG released in 2006. Obviously, when Final Fantasy III initially came out in Japan, games were still a burgeoning medium, still in their infancy really, especially when it came to plot and narrative. However, by the mid-2000s, JRPGs had been breaking new narrative ground for more or less a decade, and it would have negatively affected the success of the 3D remake if they didn't try to change it to be more aligned with the Final Fantasy experience most people were more accustomed to. Anyway, let's have a little look at these characters. When it comes to this kind of thing, what usually interests me most is etymology, why things are called what they are. Something that you'll be fully aware of if this isn't the first video of mine that you're seeing. So I wanted to check out the names of these 4 characters briefly, and see if there's anything going on here. More often than not, you come across dead ends, but it's worth doing for those brilliant wee moments where you really feel like you've figured something out. So Luneth definitely seems to imply some sort of loon/moon idea, but I'm not really sure what that would have to do with his character or the world of Final Fantasy III. Maybe he was just one entry too early. Ark is perhaps some sort of reference to all the biblical influence that the game makes use of, something we'll chat about later on. He's shown as a black mage in the introductory FMV, and there's a character called Noah in this game who is a famous mage. Maybe there's some Noah's Ark link there? Probably not. As for Refia, I'm drawing a total blank. No idea at all. I think it probably just sounded cool, and it is admittedly the best name of the 4. Ingus, though, is probably the most interesting. If you look at early screenshots and footage from before the game was released, you can see that Ingus was called Freyg, or Freyrg. The other names from this early stage are mostly similar enough to their current iterations to be recognisable, but Ingus to Freyrg seems a bit of a reach. So let's break it down. First, let's look at Ingus's Japanese name. This would read, as you can see, with this strong Z sound at the end. So let's work with that. Ingus with a Z. This is very similar to the Norse rune Ingwaz, the rune that if we were to use the modern IPA would represent this sound, which is like an ng, kind of what you'd get at the end of words like thing or ring. Runes are very complicated, and like most things outside of my expertise, but from my middling understanding of the topic, we can still reach far enough to figure out what links Ingus and Freyrg. Ingwaz is etymologically connected to the name Yngvi, a name that features in Norse mythology. This name is actually an alternate name, an older name, for one of the major gods in the Norse pantheon, Frey, also known as Freyr. So that's the connection, and it's a bit crazy that the jump is that significant, but you can follow the breadcrumb trail, and it does eventually make sense. I don't know where the G at the end of his name would have come from, or why they would even call him that in the first place, but it's cool to be able to say that Ingus is, at least in name, based off the Norse god Frey, and that we can actually understand how to make that connection. As for the personalities of each of these characters, it's very simple. Each character is meant to represent some kind of positive attribute, like they have the crests from Digimon or something. The game even tells you what these traits are, saying that Luneth is courageous, Ark is kind, Refia is affectionate, and Ingus is determined. You get a lot more inter-party dialogue in the 3D remake than in the Pixel remaster, but there's no real divergence from the one-dimensional trait that they're supposed to embody, no development throughout the story to hook you in. There are moments where you can tell that some thought has been put into it though. For example, you have guest party members throughout the game, NPCs who are relevant to the story, and you can chat to them when they're with you. In this case, you're talking about elemental weaknesses, affinities, that kind of thing. And the character who's doing the talking is Ark, the most bookish party member, who would almost definitely be the most likely one to have this conversation. So it isn't exactly like there's no depth to the characters. There are well thought through moments here and there, but you are unlikely to feel inspired by your party members and their development, even in the 3D remake. Right, let's head back to the story. We were talking crystals and prophecies before, and thematic proximity to Final Fantasy I. Final Fantasy III's idea of dispelling darkness and bringing back the light is a slight twist on what you find in Final Fantasy I, which focuses more so on realigning elemental balance rather than dealing with something more ambiguous like encroaching darkness. Final Fantasy III does have its own elemental issues, unnatural earthquakes and stuff like that, but these are side effects of the larger, far-off issue of encroaching darkness, as opposed to them being the problems themselves, which kind of feels like it lowers the stakes, with the actual cause of all this mess being so out of reach, so far in the distance. For example, you get dialogue that mentions that the light of the elements are trapped deep within the earth, but that's far too vague to really give a shit about. Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy III also attempt to tackle the concept of the void, which is an ambitious task for games made on the NES, although 3 runs a lot further with the idea, attempting to make it the whole foundation of the events of the game, rather than just the endgame, like in the first Final Fantasy. From early stages, you keep hearing buzzwords like balance, equilibrium, darkness, and most of all, hope. And these words and ideas persist throughout the entirety of Final Fantasy III, with the intention of never letting you forget your goal. However, for most of the time, it's not hugely clear what that goal actually is, outside of phrases like bringer of hope. You know that you've got to help reclaim and recover the crystals and deal with the encroaching darkness, but you're often left a bit too much in the dark, somewhat aptly, as to why you're doing all this, because vague aphorisms just don't cut it when it comes to meaningful narrative setup. After your first surprise encounter with the crystal, you return to your hometown, a small village called Your experience here diverges depending on which version you play. In the original game, your party is fully formed from the beginning, but in the 3D remake, you pick your party members up over the first 30 minutes or so. This means that the game differs quite significantly in these early stages, as the 3D version had to do a fair bit of retconning to try and invent backstories for all these new lead characters. In 2D versions of Final Fantasy III, you are all orphans raised in by the village elder, and that's it. In the 3D remake, only Luneth and Ark were raised here, and Elder Topapa mentions that a man whose face was covered in soot and his clothes burned to tatters brought newborn baby Luneth to this village, trying to add a little bit of spark to the story from the early stages. This seemingly innocuous piece of dialogue is actually vital to understanding some plot further down the line, so it's worth keeping it in mind. So now that you've been chosen as Warriors of the Light, you've got to leave your cozy wee hometown and explore the greater world. As is par for the course in early Final Fantasy, this means checking out the nearby towns and areas, hoping that you figure out what it is you're actually supposed to do. The next town you're meant to visit is a place called Kazus, which has been cursed by a djinn, and all the inhabitants have been turned into incorporeal ghost things. This doesn't mean much, and is just a very simple plot device to give you a reason to go to your next 2 locations, so you can defeat the monster and break the curse. Along the way, you go to a place called Sassoon, and shortly afterwards you recruit the Princess of Sassoon, Sarah, as your first guest NPC party member, which is another reference to Final Fantasy I's Princess Sarah. Sarah basically means princess in Hebrew, something I think I omitted to mention in my Final Fantasy I video, so it's a very fitting name for someone in her position. After you sort out the ghost situation, you meet Final Fantasy III's Cid, who is also your go-to guy for anything to do with airships. A fun wee detail is that his airship is actually parked underneath the desert sands, just like in the first Final Fantasy game. So eventually you help Cid make his way home to a settlement called Canaan, of all things. I would imagine that even the least biblically inclined of us would raise an eyebrow at Canaan being used as a place name in this game, because there's almost nothing else it could be but a reference to the selfsame region that features so heavily in the Old Testament. So to look at this, let's rewind a smidge. The starting town in this game is called When replaying Final Fantasy III for this video, my initial thought when I saw that was that it was so named because of the German language. There's a prefix in German which is literally just meaning something like ancient or original, sometimes used to denote the earliest of something. I thought this meaning was sufficient explanation for the naming of the first place in the game. It made total sense to me. However, I think the real reason it's called this only becomes clear when you take the name of another nearby place into account: Canaan. It's also no coincidence there's a Princess Sarah tangentially involved in this story too. In the Book of Genesis, is claimed to be the birthplace of Abraham, who together with Sarah and Lot travels from to Canaan. I'm hardly a biblical scholar, so I won't try to read into this too deeply, but this has to be intentional. The reason why? Well, that's definitely up for debate, but I think it's because of how nicely biblical imagery matches one of the game's most significant upcoming narrative devices, a flood. I mentioned earlier about the possibility of Ark's name being some sort of reference to the Ark from the Bible, a theory strengthened by the existence of a Noah in the story. We aren't quite there yet, but we'll get to the flood stuff soon. For now though, it's just fun to understand some of the ideas that went into the game's world building, and what real-world allusions and influences impacted the creation of places and characters. Okay, let's keep going. In Canaan, you hear of a man called Desch, a womanizing amnesiac who ends up being your next guest party member. Desch has slightly more personality than any other NPC you've met so far, but you're still pretty unlikely to get too invested. My favourite thing about Desch is honestly the alternate design for him that you can only see in the concept art for the game. It looks absolutely incredible. It would be pretty immersion breaking if he actually looked like that in the game, but it's just an example of how brilliant some of Amano's ideas were, and shows how much good stuff doesn't actually make it in. The most interesting thing about Desch though, is that he was actually originally planned to be a permanent party member. There's an interview you can find with Takashi Tokita, designer and main scenario writer for Final Fantasy IV, who discusses this. He was asked about the rotating cast of 4 and said this. In FF2, the 4th member of your party would switch out sometimes, and apparently FF3 was actually supposed to have a 5-member party. The original plan was for Desch to participate too. We were able to do a 5-member party on SNES, but we realised it was a bit much to make the whole game like that, so it wasn't permanent. He does go on to actually talk about Final Fantasy IV, like he was asked, but I've cut that bit out because we haven't reached that game yet. Again though, just like with the unused concept art, some of the most fascinating things about a game are, perhaps unintuitively, the things that are omitted. It's really interesting knowing that the plan was to break the mold by having a 5-person party, even if it didn't pan out, especially with the knowledge that that concept eventually made it into Final Fantasy IV. Seeing the way ideas and intentions flow naturally between the games in the series is really satisfying. The next 2 hours or so of gameplay is very much what you expect from an early JRPG. Going into a town, doing a wee dungeon area, rinse and repeat. The main thing that sticks out to me during this section is when you reach a place called the Living Woods, a small grove inhabited by fairies, who tell you about something called the Elder Tree, a giant tree who was once the lifeblood of these woods, but has been removed from its rightful place with catastrophic consequences. This is interesting because although it seems like this is just another run-of-the-mill piece of story, I think there's something noteworthy about where this plot idea comes from. So, if I had to guess what this is all about, which I kind of do, because that's the whole point of the video, I think that this idea is possibly linked to Shinto, and in particular, Kodama. You might have heard of Kodama before, if you've seen Princess Mononoke, or played SMT or Persona. They are very simply tree spirits, spirits that inhabit trees. The Elder Tree of Final Fantasy III is sentient, and its well-being has a knock-on effect on the health of the forest it resides in. It's eventually uprooted, carved out, and used for evil ends, much to the detriment of its surroundings. It's said that in Shinto, cutting down a tree that a Kodama lives in would bring misfortune. So much so that if it's believed that a Kodama lives in a specific tree, you'll often find a special rope wrapped around it. This rope is called a Shimenawa. There isn't a Shimenawa in Final Fantasy III, and it's very likely that the Elder Tree is not inhabited by a Kodama. But I think that this whole idea exists in the game to reflect the fact that, historically, Japanese culture has always treated trees, especially ones believed to possess a spirit or sentience, like Final Fantasy III's Elder Tree, with the utmost reverence. There's even a Japanese woodcutting technique named daisugi, which basically allows you to grow trees out of other trees, as ridiculous as that sounds. It makes a bit more sense when you actually see it. Using this method, it's possible to get lumber without having to cut the whole tree down, and means that the negative impact that people have on the ecosystem of both the tree in question and the forest it inhabits is as close to zero as possible. The point of telling you this is to get across the idea that the deeply ingrained culture of a country is always going to sneak its way into its media, exactly like this. The idea of serious negative consequences for the mistreatment of a sentient tree in a Japanese fantasy game is something that all fits very snugly. It's always very compelling when you can see examples of the historical and religious parallels between a country's culture and the media they produce, and this is a fascinating example of that. The next thing that happens plot-wise is defeating the evil mage who uprooted the Elder Tree, allowing it to return home to convalesce, and then flying your airship off the edge of the world. Despite what I just said, Sakaguchi and co aren't trying to spread the Flat Earth gospel, Rather, you find out prior to doing this that the continent you live on is actually floating, and that there's a huge world below waiting to be explored. The main drawback to this though, well, 99% of the surface world is completely flooded. The only bit that isn't is conveniently the exact place you need to go to sort out this situation. That's some luck. You'll remember that I mentioned a flood when I was talking about the biblical allusions earlier on. Unsurprisingly, this is the flood I was talking about. How the game treats this whole situation is probably a bit less than ideal in terms of how clearly it explains what's going on, what's caused this flood, but let's have a look at it and see if we can figure it out. In the Pixel remaster, the flooded surface world looks flooded with water, as most floods tend to be. In a 3D remake, it looks different. Surprisingly unwatery for a flood. It looks a lot more like swirling darkness than water, which would be a pretty interesting concept. So let's take a look and see if there's any dialogue here that elucidates this situation for us. The 3D remake makes a much bigger effort to explain this than its 2D counterpart, because it attempts to give backstories to your party members through this plot point. As for how, cast your mind back to Sid, our airship man from earlier. We escorted him home after sorting out that ghost issue. Upon arriving at home, he tells the party that they've all grown so much, which is a very unusual thing to say to 4 teenagers you've just met. Later, before you fly off the floating continent, Sid says that they can all get back to their own world, and drops the bomb that you are all from this flooded surface world, not the floating continent. Sid was flying his airship 10 years ago when suddenly everything was engulfed in darkness, which seems to possibly be referring to the flood we've just learned about. The airship crashed most likely on the floating continent, and the only survivors were Sid and the 4 protagonists. Now briefly, let's head even further back to the starting town, when Topapa the Elder tells you that a man with a sooty face and tattered clothes brought baby Luneth to the village. Here we've had one question answered and another asked. The person who arrived with baby Luneth in tow was clearly Sid, but if that was 10 years ago like Sid says, does that mean that Luneth is fucking 10 years old? This really confused me because it seemed like a huge inconsistency. A character we meet later on, Une, tells us that the surface world has actually been in stasis for 1,000 years, but I don't really understand how that's possible. After doing a fair bit of digging trying to figure out if there were inconsistencies in the plot or if I was being stupid, I discovered that there was a little bit of information lost in translation when Sid talks about the airship crash that took him to the floating continent. In Japanese, he says this, which translates to the open-ended more than 10 years ago, as opposed to the concrete 10 years ago opted for by the English. This gives sufficient wiggle room to explain the ages of the protagonists, but doesn't quite cut it for explaining the time discrepancies yet unresolved. There's every chance that you could explain it away by saying that the airship was also stuck in stasis for 1,000 years or something, before somehow coming into contact with the floating continent. I can't find a way of justifying it, where it all ties up neatly without having to really try and make it work by way of what would essentially be fan fiction. Although I'm usually pretty good at it, I find it difficult to suspend my disbelief enough for this. As for what the flood is, I think it's actually a combination of 2 things. There's another bit of dialogue that says that the floating continent was created by waves of darkness. We're not even going into how the floating continent exists, by the way, it's not worth it. So, I think because of that, we can say that this darkness is what's flooding the surface world in a way, keeping it in stasis. But the surface world is actually also flooded by water, caused by functionality issues regarding the water crystal. This whole thing is really messy. Like, I've played the game multiple times and spent time looking online to figure it out, and I still don't totally get what's going on. This is a bit disappointing, especially considering it's essentially the most fundamental plot point in the entire game. This flood and what caused it is the origin of all the issues that have led your party to do what they've got to do. So, regarding this flood, who actually caused this, and why? After a bit more story progress, that is, unflooding the world, exploring some new places, doing a big golden dungeon, you start hearing about the archmage Noah and his 3 disciples, Doga, Une, and Xande. It turns out one of these 3 is to blame for tipping the scales towards darkness, and you find out that it is Xande. The reason for everything in the story stems from Noah bestowing his 3 students with gifts. To Doga, he gave mastery over magic, to Une, he gave dominion over dreams, and to Xande, he gave mortality. We're led to understand that Xande was absolutely outraged by this, considering it a slight of the highest order, and his reaction to this disrespect ended up being the root of all of our problems. It's explained much better in the 3D remakes than the originals, to be fair, basically making the point that in stopping the flow of time and covering the surface world in darkness, he hoped to forestall his death. As such, he set to tipping those scales and putting the world into stasis. Doga and Une have a fair bit to say about the behaviour of their former comrade, with them both telling the party mortality is what makes life precious, and that it is the greatest gift of all, stuff like that. Luneth says that he doesn't get it, and then you're hit with that trite old classic of you're too young to understand. I find the idea of villainy stemming from a fear of death really compelling, and I think it's because of how well Final Fantasy implements this as motivation in later games in the series. There's something very human, and as such very relatable, about not wanting to die, about the lengths that someone will go to survive, and how that can lead someone to extremes. It's all about building a character's motivations off their most base and natural instincts, and that's why the concept behind Xande is excellent. The idea of mortality actually being a gift, the belief that life is only precious because it's ephemeral, is so widespread throughout media and fiction. However, to me it's always come off as a little bit cringy, a little bit saccharine, which is why I appreciate that even if he's in the wrong, Xande is so outraged at this. However, because of the relative incipiency of video game narratives, and this being Final Fantasy's first attempt at humanizing a villain, using very limited resources, it still ultimately falls flat. How you view him when you're playing the game for the first time is that he's still one of those villains who just is. You never see him before you fight him at the end, and most of what you know about him is through a few lines of indirect exposition here and there, so when you actually encounter him, and his dialogue has less impact than Garland's does at the beginning of Final Fantasy I, and defeating him ends up being a cakewalk, that is a wee bit disappointing. His design is cool though, and I still like him a lot, even if he does look a bit like some kind of frog person in the 3D remake. As for making your way to Xande for this slightly underwhelming contest, you have to make your way to the only landmark you can see when everything else is flooded: the sky-shattering Crystal Tower. After sorting out all 4 crystals, you can finally make your way there, where Xande awaits you at the top. The Crystal Tower, also known as Circus Tower in the game for some undisclosed reason, is notorious for being one of the most challenging gauntlets in the history of Final Fantasy, and if you go in unprepared, it is admittedly pretty tricky. It's mostly the lack of save points that mess you up, that you have to do it all in one, and the general fan opinions on this actually match up with those of Sakaguchi himself. Again, like the previous interview snippet, which was about Final Fantasy IV, this one's actually about Final Fantasy VI. He said, "From FF4 to FF5, the games really started selling, so they really took on the feeling of being major titles. I don't believe they were cutting-edge titles up through Final Fantasy III. I said this previously during a livestream, but I even really thought the last dungeon of FF3 was horrible. But we achieved sales in the millions for the first time with FF3, so we got a lot of new people on staff as a result of that. That second generation of FF coming in was quite a big deal." Hearing from the man himself that he thought Final Fantasy III's last dungeon was horrible is kind of hilarious, to be honest. Only half of that horror comes from the Crystal Tower though. The fight against Xande at the top of the tower is actually only the halfway point in this dungeon experience, and he actually isn't Final Fantasy III's primary antagonist, even though the game kind of makes you think he is in the stages prior to his defeat. The real enemy in this game, the final boss, is the Cloud of Darkness. Admittedly, the cloud does get mentioned prior to your initial meeting by the Earth Crystal of all things, so it isn't exactly like it's totally out of the blue. Plus, all through the game there's been that distant looming threat of darkness taking over and wrecking the delicate balance upon which the world's well-being hinges. It turns out that all of a sudden, that threat stops being distant and looming, and then you're fighting it. The Cloud of Darkness refers to itself/themselves as we, so I'm never exactly sure whether or not to use it or they. I guess we'll go with they. They have been pulling the strings for a while, jumping on the opportunity Xande presented in his attempt at immortality, and ultimately desiring to return everything to nothingness. This is the most classic JRPG antagonist trope, and if I'm being entirely honest, I love it. Almost every time a villain is like, I want to destroy everything and completely wipe the slate clean, I'm into it. I'm not sure what it is, but there's something engaging about it for me, the simplicity of it. However, like most every other narrative thread in the game, it's put into place a lot better later on in the series. The Cloud of Darkness is more so an idea, a collective will, than a character, and I think this works against the game. Obviously, a villain doesn't need to be relatable to be a good character, or have understandable motivations, But it feels weird in Final Fantasy III to have an antagonist like Xande so directly juxtaposed with one like the Cloud of Darkness. Xande could have been written and realised with a lot more finesse, but at least with him, the blueprint for a genuinely engaging villain was there. The Cloud of Darkness feels a bit like a cop-out in comparison and typifies what is Final Fantasy III's biggest weakness in how it tells its story. It's all too vague. From the beginning of the game to the end, there's very little narrative urgency. No specific plot-based impetus that takes you from A to B to C, and so on. Games can be open-ended and don't need to always be pushing you from one story beat to the next, but it's always nice to have something tangible you're working towards, whether on a micro or macro level. For example, Final Fantasy I and II do at least one of these things more successfully than 3. Final Fantasy I and III both share the idea of going and reclaiming the 4 elemental crystals. Although Final Fantasy I is far from a paragon of narrative excellence, I think it does a better job of making you feel the importance of your journey on a micro level than Final Fantasy III, because it really feels like you're making your way to each crystal with a definite purpose in mind. You know why you're doing it each time, and the small detours and quests you undertake feel like progress in comparison to Final Fantasy III, where it often comes across as if you're just happening on the right people and places for story progression, because you're seldom certain about what your next immediate goal actually is. This point is definitely debatable. I could absolutely understand someone disagreeing here, but it does feel like this for me. That's an example for the micro. As for the macro, Final Fantasy II is all about taking down a vicious empire hell-bent on world domination. The whole time, you know that your aim is to take down the empire, most likely by ousting the Emperor himself. Every step you take feels like you're working towards this very tangible endgame goal. Even if you don't learn much about the Emperor and his motivations like you do in 3 with Xande, it's such a strong initial premise and works to motivate the characters and the player much better than far off and supposedly threatening darkness. The story in Final Fantasy III, especially the stuff surrounding the Cloud of Darkness, is just far too nebulous, pun intended. This is compounded by how the writers attempted to round everything out in the game's final stretch, the World of Darkness. In a big twist, you find out there are 4 crystals of darkness, just like how we spend the game going after the 4 crystals of light. And we end up meeting our opposites, our counterparts, the Warriors of the Dark, who stopped the rampant light a millennium past. We heard about this a few times earlier in the game. The Warriors of the Dark are there to essentially lore dump and retroactively imbue the plot with meaning. It's all about light and dark coexisting, that light isn't inherently good and dark isn't inherently evil, but rather that it's imbalance between these two forces which causes disaster. There's nothing wrong with that, I think it's a cool premise. However, the main thing they all talk about is hope being the main force which keeps this impending void, this looming nothingness at bay. Hope, the last bastion against which the void cannot win. The word hope is also dotted throughout the game, just like I said at the start, as if that somehow makes it all make some sort of sense. This is a bit annoying. I think that if I really wanted to, I could spend a bit of time here trying to figure out some way of explaining this all, so that it tied everything together nicely. How it's a lovely metaphor for persevering through hard times or something. After all, that's the video essay way. But I'm not going to do that this time, because I genuinely do not believe that there was any intended meaning behind this. You beat the Cloud of Darkness after the Warriors of the Dark sacrificed themselves for your cause, and you get another wee scrolling prophecy like the one at the start saying stuff like, "The source of the warrior's power is hope," and so on. Look, I love lore stuff. Doing deep dives on things like this gives me life, but this is a load of shite. Especially the next bit about dreams, despair, love. I mean, you don't expect high quality writing from an NES era game, really, but this is some primary school stuff, like as if they had 2 minutes to try and write something vaguely meaningful before the deadline and this was the first draft. Usually I would go into the implications of the ending and what it all might mean, what's going on with the characters, but this time, it's not really worth it. It's just a few thank yous, some goodbyes, and that's basically it. The "you saved the world, wow, you're amazings" that we get back in are a bit on the nose, and in stark contrast to the more somber ending of Final Fantasy I, which went with the whole "and no one ever remembered their heroic deeds" vibe instead. It isn't that this kind of ending is worse, I actually usually prefer endings that provide some kind of closure like this tries to, but the execution is, unsurprisingly, a bit iffy. And I guess that's all there is to say about it really. I feel like I've been almost uncharacteristically harsh on this game's story, especially in its final stages, but that's perhaps because it appears like it makes more of an effort to say something than Final Fantasy I, to which is pretty analogous, and as such, when examined a bit closer, you realise it isn't actually saying anything. Final Fantasy I's story always seems a bit like an afterthought, which is fine, because that's just what that game is. Final Fantasy III's story, especially in its remade form, is not supposed to be an afterthought, but ends up not holding up too well against even light criticism. It is not horrible by any means, but I think it's for the best if you just try to enjoy it on a surface level. The further you dig, the more apparent the flaws are. Of the three NES Final Fantasy games though, Final Fantasy II has the best story and characters. But if I was going to recommend you play one of these three, I would still definitely recommend Final Fantasy III. And a lot of that is to do with how this game implements and polishes ideas from the first two games, whilst also introducing some new ones that would end up standing the test of time. So let's look at some of these, starting with combat, and in particular, Final Fantasy III's shiny new toy, the job system. So, combat is conceptually very similar to Final Fantasy I again, and more or less treats Final Fantasy II as, for the most part, an experiment to be discarded. This game returns to the ideas of experience being earned after battle, stats increasing as you level up, the charge system for spells, and most notably an expanded form of the job system whose bare bones, and I mean bare, can be found in Final Fantasy I. Final Fantasy II's new ideas regarding leveling up individual weapon types and spells according to frequency of usage, and stat growth which was dependent on the action taken, have been pretty much chucked aside, which is most likely for the best. However, I really think they should have stuck with Final Fantasy II's superior MP system, instead of returning to the D&D inspired spell charges. They reverted back to using MP again in Final Fantasy IV, so you can tell that they were still in a phase of experimentation, trying to figure out what worked best. This is easily the most refined iteration of the battle system so far though, which is encouraging and expected given it's their third attempt. Structurally, there's nothing new to say about the turn-based paradigm that hasn't been said in either of the two previous videos in this series, and essentially all the functional issues that plagued those games have been eradicated in the Pixel remaster, which plays really nicely. The majority of things you would come across in that version are here to be found in the 3D version too. Some jobs have had their abilities changed and modified, but the biggest difference probably comes in terms of difficulty. The 3D remake is a significantly more difficult game than its 2D counterpart, in a way that can almost seem unfair at times if you aren't willing to grind a bit, or if you don't know the game very intimately. It's actually quite infamous for being so tricky, and very well could be the most difficult main series Final Fantasy game, in terms of just what it takes to complete the story. There are two changes they made in order to implement this heightened difficulty, and they both work in tandem to attempt to balance the game. Enemies in the remake tend to have higher HP totals, but also you're limited to fighting a maximum of 3 enemies per battle, whereas in the 2D versions of the game, you can face up to 9 enemies at once. So they've made enemies harder to beat, but you have to face fewer of them at once. It seems a fair trade-off until you get to boss battles, which are much harder than in the 2D version, with much higher HP totals, but it's not like you can face fewer enemies in a one-on-one fight, so they just didn't end up being balanced like normal encounters are. Plus, many of the bosses can attack more than once in a row when it's their turn, so it can get pretty nasty pretty quickly. The difficulty level of the Pixel remaster is pretty great in my opinion, and very accommodating for first-timers, but the 3D version, although still really enjoyable for me at least, is definitely an acquired taste. Anyway, in both versions, this game is the first example in the series that we have of battles starting to reach the level of engagement and complexity we would come to expect from a turn-based Final Fantasy game, and this is almost exclusively thanks to the implementation of the job system. Just in case you aren't sure, the idea behind the job system is basically as follows. Your party members can each be a certain job, which is essentially a class, something like Black Mage, Thief, Monk, stuff like that. Each of these jobs are unique, and they have different selling points and utility based on the situation. Some weapons and equipment can only be used by certain jobs, and each job has its own ability that no other job has. The beauty of the job system is that it isn't static. The idea is that party setup is conceptually very fluid. Like in any game, there are optimal or ideal, or at least tried and tested, party dynamics, Personally, I often find myself drawn to the classic balanced party of 2 physical attackers, 1 offensive magic user, and 1 healer, but it can be fun to deviate from that sometimes. The job system does allow you this degree of flexibility, and the aim is that you frequently mix and match to find what works best in different situations. It's essentially a puzzle that you have to try and solve for most of the game. Figuring out which battles, which dungeons, which situations require which loadouts, which jobs, and which synergies is where most of Final Fantasy III's appeal lies. This video won't be a job guide, by the way. I'm not going to go through each one listing the pros and cons. You'll be able to find better versions of that elsewhere on the internet. Instead, I wanted to talk more about the logistics of the job system, whether or not it functions well, and if it's actually the freeing system it purports to be. Anyway, let's look at a few of the ways the job system is actually implemented in the game. Alongside character levels, each job has its own respective level, which increases after a certain amount of actions are taken as that job. When you describe it like that, you do realize that not everything from Final Fantasy II was actually thrown away, and some of its ideas were distilled into this job level system. It's nowhere near as cumbersome and grindy as weapon or spell leveling was in that game, and isn't something you need to think about too much as you play, but it's an interesting idea nonetheless, as it has a lot of invisible effects that will subtly impact how effectively you manage the game's combat. This system is decent, but I wish they made it clearer in the game what you actually get out of leveling each job. It's always fun to see numbers go up, but you basically have no idea what your job level means at any point, whether or not it's under or over leveled for what you're trying to do, and what you actually get out of doing it. It's still a fun idea, but could just benefit from more in-game explanation. I don't want to have to Google what does job level do in FF3 to figure it out. Moving on, something specific to the 3D version is that you have a job adjustment phase when you switch jobs. This is a period in which your stats are slightly lower for a set amount of battles until you get used to your new job. This phase lasts longer depending on how different the 2 jobs are. On the surface, this seems like an unnecessary and punishing mechanic, and ultimately it is, but I suspect that the idea here was to make you use a job a little bit before taking it into a big fight or dungeon, maybe for the purpose of getting its job level up a bit or something like that. Might make it a bit easier to use in the long run. It wasn't implemented too well though, even if the idea was helpful in concept, because it discourages play and experimentation, the bread and butter of what makes a job system inherently fun and successful. Speaking of elements that discourage experimentation, one additional issue with the job system in this game is the lack of ways to restore your magic charges mid-dungeon. You're already dissuaded from changing jobs mid-dungeon, because you don't want to be weakened by the adjustment phase. But if you were to change from a non-magic job to a magic job, for example, you wouldn't just get your charges back, you'll just be stuck with zeros across the board, unable to make use of your new job. I understand why too, because if they refreshed each time you changed jobs, it would be too exploitable and would remove a lot of the challenge, because you'd just be able to pretty much heal endlessly. What would be nice though is a way of restoring magic to facilitate job changes that wouldn't require leaving a dungeon to rest at an inn, or something like that. Final Fantasy III is, alongside early versions of Final Fantasy I, as well as Final Fantasy VIII, the only main series numbered Final Fantasy game to not have ethers in some form. In 8 it makes sense, the magic system doesn't require them. But in this game it would definitely help. I just imagine there were issues figuring out how something like this would work with the charges system, whereas with MP it would be very simple. Throughout Final Fantasy III, you get a few elixirs, which recover all of your HP and magic charges, but those are rare, and not the kind of item you'd squander halfway through a dungeon so you could become a black mage for a wee while. The game makes you backtrack if you want to recover MP, and in turn punishes you for changing jobs by making you feel like you're wasting your time. There's the potential argument that you can just plan in advance to avoid this situation, but the beauty of a job system comes in its reactive adaptability. Having the freedom to struggle, then plan, then readjust and try again, and being able to do all of that on the fly, is what makes the idea of a job system so excellent. Good job systems should allow for reactive gameplay, and Final Fantasy III's system does not always allow that. It is a primitive iteration though, and is still a lot of fun to play with despite this issue. That being said, there is something else worth mentioning about the lack of reactivity in Final Fantasy III, something which can be quite polarizing. Occasionally, the freedom afforded to you by the job system is wrenched away, and you're forced to use jobs in a very specific way to deal with a challenge the game presents you. This happens more than you'd expect, to be honest. The first example of this is when you have to use the mini spell to go into Tosis, and through the dungeon that follows, and then shortly after, the Nepto Temple. You're cornered into using casters for this, because when minied, your physical attacks are rendered useless and your defense is reduced to 1. So you essentially have to play as mages for 2 dungeons very near the start of the game, and another one a bit later on. This is more annoying than it seems because it's forced upon you just as you're getting to grips with the job system, and you're under the impression that you're free to mix things up as you like. I can understand what the game is trying to do. It wants to show you, although with too heavy a hand, that you can be adaptable to solve certain problems. After all, that's the entire point of the job system, change depending on the situation. But when situations are as arbitrary and needless as the ones in Final Fantasy III, you can't help but sigh a little bit. There's no tangible benefit to forcing you into using a party full of mages. In fact, you'll actually be in a weaker position because the party members who were not previously casters will now have a weaker job level and will be less effective in battle. Plus, you're not able to use the job you were enjoying before for an extended period of time. I don't think it ends up working out, although as I said before, I think this comes from good intentions, to try and teach you how fun and varied it can all be. It does end up feeling very constraining though, in a combat system where the idea of freedom is paramount. Another tangentially linked example is when you fight Hein. You're told by the fairies in the Living Woods, and by this guy from Toko, that Hein changes his elemental affinity and that you should use a scholar to check what he's weak to. This fight is absolutely winnable without a scholar, but they straight up tell you to use one. It's interesting, but does feel slightly gimmicky. The fight against Garuda in Saronia, possibly Final Fantasy III's most notorious boss encounter, is also one that comes across as a bit forced, for similar reasons to what we just talked about. It's noteworthy because the game prepares you for it more than any other gimmick, and it's still nearly not enough. There's a tower in Saronia which has loads of Dragoon gear in it. Like, the game tells you that you need to be a Dragoon to win this fight, gives you all the Dragoon kit, and it all just feels really strange. I can't really get past how arbitrary it is. It's a ridiculous fight too, very difficult to win without a party full of Dragoons, unless you're vastly overleveled, and even following the gimmicky rules put in place by the game, you might still lose. I can't understand it. You can see my fight on screen now. All I did was use jump with each Dragoon to try and avoid Garuda's lightning attack, a tactic the game pretty much tells you to use, and I won by the skin of my teeth. I did it without 4 Dragoons in the 3D version, just to show you can do it differently to what the game suggests, but I found that I couldn't really beat it without at least 2 Dragoons. Someone better at the game than me probably could, but it would be a monumental effort. There are just too many moments like this throughout Final Fantasy III for me. I haven't even spoken about the enemies and dungeons where every enemy splits if physically attacked by any other class than Dark Knight, so you're cornered into using Dark Knights and mages for significant stretches late into the game. 1 or 2 moments like this would have been fine if the purpose was to gently teach the player about the possibilities of the job system, how party setup can change depending on the situation, how fun it can be to figure it all out, but the game takes it too far too often, which is unfortunately to its detriment. I will say though, this doesn't make up most of the game, just enough to leave a sour taste in your mouth. The remaining majority, in which you're given real choice and freedom, not just an impression, is really fun. For example, let me talk you through what I ended up doing for the final boss fight in the 3D version, because I had a great time figuring this out. My party consisted of a ninja, a bard, a devout, and a Viking. The Viking is the best defensive job in the game, and its unique ability is Provoke, a skill that almost always goes first, and when successful makes an enemy target you exclusively, sparing your party members from dealing with attacks. I equipped 2 shields on my Viking to boost his defensive capabilities, meaning that he took literally no damage from physical attacks. The ninja is the best damage dealer in the game, and is the only job able to throw shurikens, which end up being Final Fantasy III's most reliable way to deal some proper damage. So that's where most of the offensive firepower was. The bard is, at least in the 3D version, my pick for the best job in the game when fully kitted out. Depending on what harp you have equipped, you can perform a different action, meaning that the bard has the ability to do a party-wide heal, apply buffs like Protect, Shell, and Haste, and even deal some unbelievable damage using a percentage-based attack, meaning that the more health the opponent has, the more damage is done, as you can see by these delicious numbers on the screen now. It has unbelievable utility, and there's no penalty for switching equipment in battle, making it a lot of fun to use a bard. The Devout is the best pure healer in the game, and in this party, mostly acts as a safety net, healing when needed, applying buffs, doing a wee bit of damage here and there. Ultimately, with this tactic, the Cloud of Darkness fight, which can often prove pretty troublesome, was an absolute piece of piss. It was really satisfying to plan out this idea and watch it succeed more than I could have hoped. Despite the foibles and shortcomings dotted throughout Final Fantasy III's nascent job system, it is still really immersive when you get to grips with it, and it's the main thing that keeps on pulling you back in. As I've said plenty so far, later Final Fantasy games take this idea and run much further with it, but Final Fantasy III's combat and job system is undeniably enjoyable. Even though I've been kind of harsh, like in the story section, I would like your main takeaway from this to be that despite some teething problems and heavy-handedness, Final Fantasy III is, above all else, still really fun to play. Okay, now we're at the good stuff. This section is all about what influenced certain elements of Final Fantasy III, be it mythological, historical, societal, anything like that. Basically, it's the chapter where we take a look at some part of the game and try to figure out how exactly that came about, kind of like what we did at the beginning with the etymology for Ingus's name. Let's think of this section kind of like a trivia chapter. Rather than going down a path and looking at interesting stops along the way, like the story section, this will just be a collection of individual elements, all distinct in their own right. To keep it relevant to what we just talked about, we'll begin with something related to the job system. There's a job in Final Fantasy III called Onion Knight. It's the starting job in the 2D versions of the game, and although replaced by Freelancer in the 3D remake, it does exist as an optional job you can get from doing some side quest stuff. In Final Fantasy side games like Dissidia and Theatrhythm, Onion Knight is the main representative for Final Fantasy III, the closest it gets to having a main character, an original creation meant to collectively represent the game. I've always wondered what this name was about because it's so unusual. Why onions? I'd looked into it briefly before, years ago, but wasn't really satisfied by anything I came across, so I thought now would be a good time to properly invest some real time and thought into it and figure it out. If you're a fan of Game of Thrones or the Song of Ice and Fire books, you maybe wondered if there's any link between why Davos is called the Onion Knight in that and the Onion Knights in Final Fantasy III. But I think we can most likely scrap that idea. I think it's almost certainly coincidental. We could always entertain the prospect that it's somehow a metaphor of sorts, but I honestly don't know where I could take it so that I could genuinely believe myself by the time I reached the end. One thing that I found, which could possibly have some credence to it as an origin, although still unlikely, can be found if we look at kennings. A kenning is a figure of speech found predominantly in Norse and Old English, where instead of using a noun, you say something a bit more roundabout. A good example from Beowulf is battle sweat, meaning blood. You get the idea. There's a record of a kenning from around the 10th century used by a poet called Eyvind. The kenning in question is Imunlauker, literally meaning battle onion or battle leek, and it's used in place of the noun sword. Given its shape, leek seems a bit more likely. This is then connected to the original Japanese name for Onion Knight, which is basically onion swordsman. However, the Japanese word they used for onion refers to round onions, as you can see, not leeks. This is one of those tangents, as is becoming par for the course in my videos, where we do not reach anything resembling a satisfying answer. I spent absolutely ages trying to figure this out, and then, pretty much accidentally, as I was looking for info on something else we'll discuss shortly, I stumbled upon some interviews with people who worked on Final Fantasy III, where they just tell you the answer to this question. I wanted to keep that kenning stuff in because it took me so long to find, and it is pretty cool, but here's the actual reasoning behind it all. On the official Final Fantasy website, of all places, you can find interviews with Hiromichi Tanaka and Koichi Ishii, conducted in celebration of the game's 30th anniversary. Both of these interviews discuss the origin of this name, and it turns out that the Onion Knight is called that because its NES sprite apparently looks like an onion. Here's an excerpt from the interview with Hiromichi Tanaka. When asked if there was a job he liked best, he said, "Oh, that would be Onion Knight. When I saw Mr. Ishii's illustration, my first thought was, come on, this is an onion. It looked like the cluster of flowers that bloom from onion stalks, so I think the idea came from there. That's how it got the name Onion Knight. There was no hesitation." Koichi Ishii basically says this was the case in his interview too. It almost feels disappointing after convincing myself for so long that there would be some deep and fascinating reason behind it, that the Onion Knight is so named because it looks like a fucking onion. But I guess that one's on me. Regardless of what the origin is, it's still good to know. So next up, we get to look at something very exciting. Final Fantasy III is the first game to feature Moogles. They hang out in Doga's manor and are exactly what you expect them to be, insofar as they're really cute and say Kupo at the end of every sentence. As for why Moogles exist and what they're supposed to be, let's look at their name in Japanese. This is a portmanteau of the Japanese words for mole and bat. That explains a lot, to be honest. They do kind of look like mole bats. Let's head back to the Onion Knight interviews from just a second ago, in particular the one with Koichi Ishii. You may remember from the Final Fantasy II video that he designed the Chocobo, and it turns out that he was also the mind behind the Moogles, and says in this interview that he actually came up with the base idea for the Moogle when he was just a child. I made the character when I was in elementary school, at which time I was drawing all kinds of fantasy creatures and the like. I liked koalas, and also animals that weren't so popular like frilled neck lizards. But I especially liked koalas, so I draw koala-like creatures that were all white koalas with wings like a bat, but they can also blow up their body and float around. Those wings are for controlling direction in the air, not flapping around to fly. Obviously, this idea has been adapted over time to make them less koala-like and more feline. Moogle design does change throughout the game, something we'll see as I do more of these videos, but almost every Moogle at least has bat-like wings, vaguely cat-like facial features, and occasionally a cute wee pom-pom on the top of their head. These are the base traits that different games in the series build upon to make their own kind of Moogle. The other thing about Moogles that every person who's ever played Final Fantasy has probably wondered is why do they say Kupo? It's so normal to me now that I don't even think about it anymore, but it is a little bit strange. Like with nearly everything else we try to figure out, getting a concrete answer for why they say this proves to be immensely difficult. We know for certain that when Moogles were initially introduced in the Japanese version of Final Fantasy III on the NES, they did use a wee sentence ender, but it wasn't Kupo. Instead they said nya, which is basically the Japanese version of a cat's meow. Which makes you wonder if Kupo is supposed to be analogous to a cat's meow or dog's woof, but for a Moogle. In the 3D remake, it was changed to Kupo, after that became the norm in other entries. As for why Kupo, I think that it just might be because it sounds cute. As boring as that idea is, it's a pretty sweet and endearing sound. There's an idea that's not too uncommon in Japanese media called kyara gobi, which basically means character word ending, or at least something to that effect. It's essentially just what it sounds like. It's basically a catchphrase or feature exclusive to a character, or in the case of Moogles, an entire race of creatures. I think they just wanted to pick something to give them more life, make them more recognizable, and thus chose Kupo relatively arbitrarily. I've not played Disgaea, but to my knowledge the Prinnies from that series say dude in a similar way to how Moogles say Kupo. It's not too satisfying an answer, but I don't know if there's much more to it than that. They just did a great job of running with the idea and making it so widespread. Next up is another staple of the series, Masamune, and to a lesser extent Muramasa. These are both weapons that you can find in some capacity in nearly every Final Fantasy game. Masamune in particular is really widespread. And I don't think I really discussed it, but it was even in the first two Final Fantasy games as a sort of ultimate weapon. This sword is simply a reference to Japan's most legendary blacksmith, Masamune. Final Fantasy III's 3D version also contains a weapon called Muramasa, which you earn from maxing out your ninja job level. Muramasa was another of Japan's most legendary swordsmiths. Both Masamune and Muramasa lived in feudal Japan, although separated by the centuries. Masamune lived most of his life during the Kamakura period of Japanese history, whereas Muramasa lived during the subsequent era known as the Muromachi period. There's a funny sort of irony in my ninja simultaneously equipping a Masamune and a Muramasa, considering how different these weapons and their creators supposedly were. In popular culture, Muramasa's blades have come to be considered as cursed or evil, in contrast to Masamune's pure swords. In Marcus Sesko's book about Masamune, he briefly dives into a famous legend regarding Masamune and Muramasa, which we'll read over now. Incidentally, the often quoted legend about Masamune and his supposed student Muramasa having a competition over the sharpness of their swords should not go unmentioned here. The contest was for each to suspend their blades in a small creek, with the cutting edge facing the current. Muramasa's sword cut everything that passed its way. Fish, leaves floating down the river. Highly impressed by his pupil's work, Masamune lowered his sword into the current and waited patiently. Not a leaf was cut, The fish swam right up to it, and the air hissed as it gently blew by the blade. After a while, Muramasa began to scoff at his master for his apparent lack of skill in the making of his sword. Smiling to himself, Masamune pulled up the sword, dried it, and sheathed it. All the while, Muramasa was heckling him for his sword's inability to cut anything. A monk who had been watching the whole ordeal walked over and bowed low to the two swordmasters. He then began to explain what he had seen. The first of the swords was by all accounts a fine sword, however it is a bloodthirsty, evil blade, as it does not discriminate between who or what it will cut. It may just as well be cutting down butterflies as it could be severing heads. The second was by far the finer of the two, as it does not needlessly cut that which is innocent and undeserving. In cutting everything that touched it, Muramasa's sword showed its bloodthirsty and evil nature. As such, this led to a tradition that a Muramasa blade must taste blood before being sheathed. Obviously, there isn't too much more to add on this topic than that, but I wanted to mention all this because I'm sure that some of the people watching this are as much into Final Fantasy as I am, and smile to themselves every single time they come across a Masamune or Muramasa in one of the games, and I hope that having this extra bit of information about these two makes it mean a little bit more the next time you come across one. Okay, now we're heading into a big section. Final Fantasy III is the first Final Fantasy game featuring summons. Over time, this has become a huge part of Final Fantasy's identity, and this is where all of that started. Historically through the series, these are the things most clearly based on extant mythological figures. You do get new original summons popping up throughout the series, but early on, Final Fantasy settled on a small group of what you could call staple summons, classic summons, and these are basically the ones you come across in Final Fantasy III. These are, ignoring the Chocobo summon, Shiva, Ramuh, Ifrit, Titan, Odin, Leviathan, and Bahamut. I think the two main summons missing from this list that have OG status, as far as I'm concerned, would be Phoenix and Alexander, my personal favourite, but they get their time in the sun later. Over the course of these videos, I would basically like to talk a little bit about every summon in the series, and their origins and the mythology, or lack thereof, from which they were taken. As such, we're going to briefly touch on the 7 summons we've just listed, and find out a bit more about them. Not in too much detail, this isn't a video about mythology, so I'm going to try and make it more of a surface level thing. This probably won't be the only time we'll discuss summons like Shiva, by the way, who has multiple iterations worth mentioning throughout the series, but for now let's just focus on how they appear in Final Fantasy III. Shiva is the first name that comes to mind for me when I think of summons in the Final Fantasy series. I think it probably comes from replaying the early stages of Final Fantasy VIII ad nauseam as a kid, and I would always junction Shiva to Squall, because I thought her icy nature matched his personality the best. Final Fantasy's resident Queen of Ice is an unusual one origins-wise though, as you might be aware of if you know anything about Hinduism. Shiva is one of the major deities in the Hindu pantheon, often placed alongside Brahma and Vishnu. I discussed this concept very briefly in the latter stages of my last video about mythology in Hades. I'll link that section in the description if you want to watch it, but I'll put a still from it on screen now, so you can see that Shiva, in Hinduism, is the destroyer. He's also a male god, often viewed as a symbol of virility even, which is where a lot of the confusion comes from because Final Fantasy's Shiva is the most ubiquitous female summon in the whole series. Hindu Shiva is sometimes depicted as blue though, just like Final Fantasy Shiva, so that's something. I think there are 2 things we still need to figure out though. Firstly, why is Shiva female? And secondly, why is she associated with ice? In Hinduism, there is a version of Shiva which is half male and half female, where he's essentially merged with his consort/wife, Parvati. But this doesn't seem like enough. I think what we have to do then is entertain the prospect that the summon Shiva is not based on Shiva in Hinduism, despite them sharing a name. There are multiple mythologies over the world which contain some sort of woman or goddess associated with snow, ice, or winter. There's the Yuki-onna from Japanese myth, the Kaliach from Celtic myth, Morana from Slavic myth, Skadi from Norse myth, all of whom are interesting in their own right, but don't seem like they match the vibe that Shiva has. I guess we could always look back at the name and see if there's anything similar to Shiva. There's another Slavic goddess, a fertility goddess named Shiva, who may or may not be linked to Sif, a Norse goddess who also represented fertility, but despite the similarity in name, they're about as different as could be to Shiva in purpose. This leads to the final theory that gets bandied about, and it might even be the one I believe most. It's essentially that Shiva is for the most part an original creation, and named Shiva because of the similarity to the word shiver. The katakana reading of Shiva's name lines up with how Shiva would be pronounced in Japanese too, more or less. This seems way too obvious, and simultaneously unfathomable in a way, but it is possible. Look, we're here again, where after loads of research and theory crafting we don't have a concrete answer, but the likelihood is that Shiva is a byproduct of various ideas, taking bits and pieces from different roots and mythologies, but diverging enough in her final iteration to feel totally unique and original. Ramuh is Final Fantasy's go-to lightning summon. He's an old man with an enormous beard. When it comes to his origins, it's like Shiva in the sense that it's probably a few things combined, but unlike Shiva in the sense that it's easier to figure out. I think there are 3 elements that could combine to create Ramuh. The thing you hear most when looking into this, because of how similar the names are, is that Ramuh is based on the Hindu god Ramuh. Again, someone I spoke about very briefly in my video about Hades, but I personally don't really buy into it that much. I do think he's based on a god, but I think it's more likely to be the Egyptian sun god Ra than Ramuh. Ra was also god of the sky as well as the sun, but that's a very tenuous link to thunder and lightning, not nearly enough on its own to be the basis for Ramuh. Next up is a figure from Mesopotamian legend called Ramuh, so a similar name who also has a big beard. Not much more to say about that one. Finally, the most convincing element, which is simply the Hebrew word for thunder. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it correctly by just saying Ram, but you get the idea. This is why at the beginning I mentioned that Ramuh was a bit like what Shiva might also be, a hodgepodge of influence that coalesced to form, perhaps counterintuitively, something entirely new. All of these things combined, or maybe just 1 or 2 of them, may have had some influence on Ramuh's creation. I'd say we probably started with the hardest 2 to explain. Ifrit has a much more concrete origin, which again we won't delve too deeply into. I know it's meant to be pronounced Ifrit, by the way, but I just can't do it. I've been saying Ifrit like this since I was 4 years old, and I'm not going to stop, so sorry about that. An Ifrit is a creature from Islamic mythology, and to simplify it, is kind of like a demon. What we should concern ourselves with is how Ifrit appears in Final Fantasy III, and if that lines up with the source material. I would say that Ifrit looks relatively demonic. I can't find any specific reference to the Ifrit of mythology having horns or anything like that, but horns are a classic indicator of something demonic, so as far as I'm concerned, that's some well-taken creative license. The only other thing that would need to match up is some sort of affinity for or connection to fire. In Islamic folklore, Ifrit are associated with Jahannam, the Islamic underworld. Throughout the Quran, this hell is referred to as fire, or fiery, on countless occasions, as you can see. So, if an Ifrit is supposed to be a chthonic demon, and the chthonic area in question is pretty fiery, I think we found some pretty solid reasoning for how Ifrit is depicted in this game. Finally, we get to some Greek mythology, something I feel a lot more confident talking about. This one is pretty basic and is similar to Ifrit in the sense that Titan doesn't refer to one specific mythological figure, but rather a group. Again, you could probably guess at this point, but I talk about the Titans a fair amount in my Hades video, so once more I'll link to that section, but let's go over the basics again. The gods that you would recognize from Greek myth, like Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, are what you would call Olympian gods. They are representative of a certain age of Greek mythology. The age that came before them was the age of the Titans. To clarify, although it may seem like the name Titan means that they were huge, that's not really the case. They were by most accounts just gods with a misleading collective name. So that's where Titan comes from in Final Fantasy III. His appearance makes sense, humanoid but ripped, but the real question is why he's aligned with the element of Earth. I think it's most likely to do with the fact that there was a war between these 2 generations of gods that I've just spoken about, where the Olympians managed to overthrow the rule of the Titans, and some of them were locked up in Tartarus, the grimmest part of the Greek underworld. So I would reckon that Titan is an Earth elemental summon to represent the fact that plenty of the Titans were locked up under it. Odin is a pretty familiar name, as gods go. This Odin is undoubtedly based upon the king of the gods from Norse mythology, at least in name, but a few of the design choices definitely divert from what you would maybe expect. It's worth saying that throughout Norse mythology, you get very few descriptions of what gods actually looked like, so it's more than okay to take creative license with them. There are 2 things that always come to mind when I think about Odin personally, which are the fact that he only has 1 eye, and that he has an 8-legged horse called Sleipnir. The reason Odin only has 1 eye is because he gave the other one up in his quest for wisdom and enlightenment. It's a fun story worth checking out. I think it's safe to say that the eye thing wasn't even discussed when designing Odin in Final Fantasy III, although there is what's possibly a reference to this idea further down the line in Final Fantasy VIII. Maybe. That's for another video. Back to Final Fantasy III, putting Odin on a horse is a good start for matching up with the mythology, but it would have been cool if they'd gone with a few more legs just to line it up with the stories. Funny enough, there is actually a regular enemy in Final Fantasy III called Sleipnir, who has 6 legs, but that just makes things even more confusing, so we'll put a lid on that. Another thing worth discussing is that in the 3D version of the game you can steal the spear Gungnir from Odin, which is a cool detail, as Gungnir is the name of the spear that Odin actually wielded in Norse myth. I don't have footage of it though, because I didn't bother stealing it, sorry. The most important thing to discuss though, is what Odin is most famous for, in Final Fantasy at least, which is his attack Xantetskin, an instant kill attack of legendary status. It more or less translates as sword that cuts iron, which sounds pretty cool, but obviously it's not taken from Odin's mythology. That's fine though. I can't find any sort of history or paper trail for a real-life origin of Xantetskin as a sword in Japanese history, unlike with the Masamune Muramasa stuff, so we can probably treat it as creative license as well. In the interview with Hiromichi Tanaka that we looked at earlier from the Onion Knight section, he says this: "Monster design and data was handled by Mr. Kazuhiko Aoki. He's a fan of Western naming, so monsters like Jormungand came from him. I did the formatting for monster data and all the player data design, then gave the data and stat balances to him and had him make the monsters he wanted based on that. Obviously, monster design and summon design aren't necessarily the same, but this could give some reasoning to this blend of a Norse god with a Japanese attack. A little bit later in the same interview, they talk about creating Odin. When the battlefield is made into one area, there's a visual difference between the player side and the monster side, with Mr. Amano's monster designs on one end and Mr. Ishii's character pixel art on the other. We wanted to play something monster-like on the player side too, to create a visual that pits monster versus monster, and so from that I suggested including summons. The first one we created was the Xantetskin wielding Odin. Odin's visual design came from a picture that happened to be in Mr. Amano's illustrations of a man riding a horse, which looked close to the design we wanted. I can't remember exactly why we decided he uses Xantetskin. There were even people on the development team saying, "Doesn't Odin always use a spear?" It's funny how thrown together it all seems in these interviews when I always assume more thought goes into this stuff, but if anything, it's a really interesting fact that Odin was actually the first Final Fantasy summon ever created. The more you know. As for Leviathan, this isn't technically its first appearance in the series. You may remember from Final Fantasy II that the party gets swallowed by a giant sea monster called Leviathan. Obviously, the summon Leviathan in Final Fantasy III is not the same as the plot device in 2, but the concept behind them is ultimately from the same place. Final Fantasy III's Leviathan is a sea serpent / sea monster, and is based upon the creature of the same name that appears throughout the Old Testament. Design-wise, however, it's most likely that the biggest inspiration was the Ryujin, a Japanese sea god who took the form of a dragon. Dragons are usually depicted in Eastern mythology as more serpentine, in contrast to the Western perspective on dragons that I imagine most of us are more accustomed to. Speaking of that, let's move on to our final summon for this game. Bahamut, just like Leviathan, is not a newcomer to the series, having appeared as the King of the Dragons in Final Fantasy I, helping you upgrade your jobs / classes to their superior forms. Although I said at the start that Shiva is always the Final Fantasy summon I think of first, Bahamut is almost inarguably the Final Fantasy series' most emblematic and recognizable summon. So where does Bahamut come from? Is the Bahamut of mythology also a really cool dragon? Well, not really. Bahamut plays a role in medieval Islamic cosmology. The role in question? Big fish. Big fish that gets stood on by a big bull. So how did we get from big fish to big dragon? Well, the answer is something I spoke about a lot in the Final Fantasy I video. It's all thanks to Dungeons and Dragons. The first recorded instance of Bahamut being depicted as a dragon was in 1975, when he was added into the D&D lore as Bahamut, Dragon King. His appearances in Final Fantasy I and III were just lifted from this iteration of the mythological figure, and it has become so remarkably widespread since then that it's now hard to imagine Bahamut being anything but a legendary dragon. Anyway, I guess that's all there is to it for now. I've no doubt we'll talk about Bahamut and all the other summons again in future videos, but for now I've taken up more than enough of your time on this topic, so let's move on to our final and thankfully shortest section. So before we finish up, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the music in Final Fantasy III. I'm going to try something new for this video, which is not doing any voiceover for this section and instead leading the discussion through text alone. This way it's a lot easier to pay attention to the music, and I'll still be able to say what I want to say. Sorry if you're listening to this like a podcast or something, but you'll still be able to hear some good tunes. As a slight caveat ahead of time, I really love the music in Final Fantasy and there's some cool stuff that I'm keen to point out, but there's not much I can do in the way of deep critical musical analysis and extensive forays into musical theory, so please don't expect too much of me. I hope it'll still be interesting though. Let's jump in. I'm sure you got used to not having to hear me speak for a while there, but I'm afraid I'm popping back in so we can close this video out. Diving into Final Fantasy III has felt a bit unusual, because in discussing the story, characters, and job system, I was slightly more critical than I would usually be. I think I ended up giving this game a much harder time than Final Fantasy I and II, but that's representative of the fact that my expectations for those two games are much lower than my expectations for Final Fantasy III. I'll say now on the record that although I prefer the storytelling of Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy III is by a distance the best of the NES-era Final Fantasy games. I worry that that hasn't come across, because I've spent a fair bit of time pointing out how elements of the game have fallen a bit short, but that's because in delving deep into Final Fantasy III, I'm holding it to a much higher standard. People often say that Final Fantasy IV is the first game in the series that feels like a Final Fantasy game. I think I've even said that before, but after spending time with both versions of this game, the 3D remake and the Pixel remaster, I genuinely think this is the first entry in the series that starts to really embody what playing Final Fantasy feels like. There's so much here that lays groundwork for the best entries in the series in literally every sense. Final Fantasy III's plot and characterization is all a bit wishy-washy, but after playing later Final Fantasy games, you can look back on this one and see ideas that had a real influence down the line, and that led to some of the best story beats and characters that the series has to offer. Final Fantasy III's job system is an incredible concept, put into practice with less finesse than it deserved. However, later entries take the mistakes made in this game and change it up so that each subsequent iteration of the job system is excellent. Final Fantasy III introduced so much to the series, so many enormous ideas that it couldn't quite live up to, but these ideas get repurposed and polished further down the line, meaning that even if it doesn't reach the lofty heights you would expect from Final Fantasy, it still deserves credit for being so ambitious. Almost every part of Final Fantasy III paved the way for something greater, and considering it was the first showing for so many of these Final Fantasy and JRPG staples, considering that there was so much to integrate and make cohesive, it still all came together pretty decently in the end. Final Fantasy III is not a masterpiece. However, the masterpieces that go on to define the Final Fantasy series would never have been what they were without Final Fantasy III. Well, there we are. It's really nice to have this one finished. After the mythology behind Hades video, I found it hard to get back into this. Doing a video as extensive and lengthy as that really took it out of me, but I'd just like to say thank you for your patience if you've been waiting for this one, and I really hope you all enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, sharing it around, whatever works for you. If you liked it enough to consider supporting the channel in another way, please check out my Patreon account in the link below and see if that tickles your fancy. You can get benefits like being able to vote on future video topics, additional gaming content, and shoutouts in videos. Speaking of, I'd like to give a huge shoutout to my top tier patrons. Cloud3514, Genetic Gen, Ryan Teague, Subnats, The Greenhorn Lowborn, and Unseen Sounds. I really cannot express how grateful I am for your support. What else is there? You can find a link to my Twitter in the description below if you want more frequent updates from me. And I think that's about it. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully see you next time.